Hey everybody, so in today's video we are going to talk about congressional leadership and committees. And our objective for this set of notes is to think about how the leadership in Congress and their ideological leaning, as well as committees in Congress, affect that policy-making process that we looked at last unit. So we're going to be looking at first the leadership, right? Who's in charge in Congress? And then we'll move into the first aspect of lawmaking and policymaking, which is committees. So let me go ahead and present my set of notes. Right. So first, basically, we're just going to be looking at the hierarchy of power in both the House and Senate. And before we get into it, I wanted to again give a brief overview of our current Congress, which is the 117th Congress. So if you remember talking about this in class, every 2 years, there is a new session of Congress. So this session started on January 3rd, 2021. The next session will begin on January 3rd, 2023. This is our most diverse session yet. We have had the most diversity in terms of demographics when it comes to religion, socioeconomic status. But one of the common critiques is that despite this, Congress is often seen as still not representative of the American public. At large, the constituency, the people that the representatives and the senators are actually representing in their job. So Congress has been male dominated since the first session. In 1789. Female membership has grown, of course, but the majority is still male. The majority of Congress is college educated, and the majority also has above average income, meaning that more than half of the membership even has a net worth more than $1 million, which obviously is quite substantially larger than the average American income. The ages itself of Congress are not representative because, the average age in the House is 58, in the Senate it's 62. And, just looking at their backgrounds, right, what they did prior to being a congressperson, most people, representatives and senators, have backgrounds in law, in public service, business. So they do have a lot of experience in the type of policies and things that they're actually creating once they get into Congress itself. But it's not a requirement that you have any government experience per se. Okay, so I wanted to just kind of show you a quick breakdown of the party demographics in Congress and how diverse, like what I was talking about. So you can take a look at this chart here. But as you can see, the majority, this purple dot represents white congresspeople. So we do have majority here. However, we do have a substantial amount of other colored dots representing the diversity. And when it comes to, gender, we have 135 women, again, the most in our history. And we have the most religious diversity ever as well. Most still identify as Christian, whether that's Protestant or Catholic, but there is more religious diversity than ever before. And then finally, I wanted again to call your attention to the balance of power when it comes to the 117th Congress in terms of party composition. So in the House, right, we have 435 seats available. We do have 2 vacancies currently, which will be addressed in the midterm election of 2022. So again, this whole thing can shift depending on how that midterm election goes in November. But as we looked at in class, the House has more Democratic seats. We have 222 Democrats versus 211 Republicans. And then in the Senate, we have a split of 50-50. So with the vice presidency being a Democrat, right, we tend to see that the Senate also leans toward the liberal or Democratic side as well. So we, in this instance, say that Congress in this session is unified. Okay, so now what I want us to do is look at the leadership structure of both chambers, both sections of Congress. So whether it's the House of Representatives or the Senate, we have hierarchical structures, meaning someone is at the top and they kind of delegate authority and responsibilities to lower members of kind of this chain here. We're going to talk about each individual chamber separately. And one of the first things I want to note is that of all of these positions, there are only 3 that are actually mentioned in the Constitution. And those are the Speaker of the House, the Vice President, and the President pro tempore of the Senate. That's it. That's all the Constitution states. And then it does state then that each chamber, the House and the Senate, do have the ability to choose their other officers. So this is how we get the remaining members under this kind of flow chart here, right? Whether it's the majority leaders, minority leaders, whips, caucuses, conference chairs. Okay, so now what happens, like how we actually get these specific members underneath, is at the start of each congressional session in January, right, 2021, and then the next in 2023, each chamber is going to elect their leaders. So the House parties will get together, the Senate parties will get together, and they will form what are called caucuses. Now, these caucuses essentially are the name given to a meeting of or organization of all party members in the House. Okay, so you'll hear me talk about that as we go through these next couple of note sets. But they're going to gather within each chamber, and they're going to determine their choices for the leadership positions that you see here. All right, so for example, Republicans in the House will get together and decide, all right, who do we want for, in this case, the Republicans, as we said, are the minority in the House of Representatives, the minority party. Who do we want for the minority leader, for instance? Okay, and then vice versa would happen in the Senate, and they would make those decisions all the way down to, minority whip, minority caucus, and conference chair. Okay, and one thing to note is that when they vote, these leadership positions, it's almost invariably, without a doubt, a party line vote, meaning Republicans vote for Republicans and Democrats vote for Democrats. Now, I wanted to clarify and reinforce one more time what I'm talking about when it comes to majority versus minority. Remember, this is referring to the number of seats that each party has. So if there are more Democratic seats than Republican seats, the Democrats would get the majority positions versus Republican minority. So obviously, this is not set in stone, right? This is going to change with elections. So don't think about it like the majority leader is always of a certain party, minority leader is always a certain party. It just depends on how many seats there are of each party in Congress. So we're going to start with the House of Representatives. And we're going to start with that constitutional position and the person at the top, the leader of the House of Representatives. And this is the Speaker of the House. And the Speaker of the House is always of the majority party. So right now, we do have a Democratic majority, which is Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi is a Democrat. She is the Speaker of the House. And I did have a star next to this because the Speaker of the House is probably the most powerful person, not only in the House, but probably in Congress itself. They are elected by the whole House of Representatives. Okay, so this position carries a lot of weight to it. So Nancy Pelosi, as Speaker of the House, presides over the House when in session. So presiding over one of the chambers means that you call it to order. You are the one in charge of the organization. And one of the things as well that is important is when the House is in session, one of the major roles of the Speaker of the House, as we will see when it comes to lawmaking, is making committee assignments. So who is on what committee in Congress, deciding and assigning bills to be voted on and debated. And we'll talk about this process in another video, but that's the main role here. And ultimately, the Speaker of the House is kind of like the filter. That's really important, like the filter for bills. If the Speaker of the House does not necessarily feel like a bill needs to go to a committee to be voted on and discussed and debated, it just doesn't go. And then another important, aspect of the Speaker of the House is the Speaker of the House is also second in line to succeed the president after the vice president. So according to the 25th Amendment, if the president is unable to serve, then it's the vice president and then Speaker of the House. So we have never gotten to this point, but there is that weight of the position as well. Okay, so in the House of Representatives, also let's move to the majority and minority leaders of the House. These leaders are also known as, quote, floor leaders. Floor is where all of the conversation and debate and action happens in Congress. So these leaders lead debate among their parties, right? Whether it's the majority party at the time or the minority party. And they are really in charge of guiding discussion from their side of the aisle or their ideology. So when they're discussing a bill, they are the first speakers to be recognized in debate by the Speaker of the House. The Speaker will turn to them first to kind of open things up, right? They have the floor first to talk. They're going to kind of lead the way in terms of their party's wishes, their complaints, positives about whatever bill is being discussed. And they also, in recent years, have really kind of become the spokespersons for the party. You'll see a lot in the media, the minority and majority leaders. And you'll also see, them representing their parties when you turn on the news, for example. Now, the Speaker of the House will also look to these leaders when it comes to making committee assignments and scheduling bills that will eventually, potentially make it to the floor for debate. And eventually, hopefully for the bill itself, the voting of the bill for the whole House of Representatives. Okay, so below the leaders, whether that's the majority or minority leaders, we have the House majority and minority whips. The position is called a whip. And I think you might see why here in a second. Now, the whips are in charge of party discipline, which sounds strange, but essentially their job is to keep, a tally of votes among party members. So they're looking like, okay, we have this many seats in our party, who's voting in what way, who might be on the line, maybe thinking of voting a different way outside of the party. And they're going to encourage, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, those party members who might be wavering or on the fence to vote with the party. So they're kind of strong arming them, to kind of vote in line with the political party. One of the things, for example, they might offer favors, even endorsements during elections, right? That can have a persuasive influence for that representative, who, remember, are up for re-election every 2 years. And one other thing just to mention really fast about these whips here, they're also going to keep track of their party members and make sure that they're in good standing. They're acting ethically. They can even ask a member to step down or leave Congress themselves. So definitely something to consider. Okay, so let's move into the Senate. So if we move over to the Senate, right, actually, you know what? I'm going to jump back to this right here. And if we take a look again at this hierarchy over on the Senate side, you'll notice that aside from these two positions at the top versus just the Speaker, the one in the House, the bottom section is really the same. You've got majority and minority leaders, majority and minority whips, and you've got your conferences and caucuses on the majority and minority side. And that's set up on purpose, right? This is supposed to be checks and balances between the two chambers of Congress, right? Remember the cup versus the saucer. So there is supposed to be that kind of additional layer to this. So there is a similar procedure or process or structure in both. So the only difference really at the very top here when it comes to the vice president and the president pro tempore. So let me get back into my presentation. So let's start with the vice president. The Senate is predominantly presided over by the vice president. Now, the vice president, according to the Constitution, has the presiding role, but they are considered a non-voting member. So the only stipulation is that the vice president votes only if there is a tie to break. So technically, They're the 101st member of Congress or of the Senate, but only voting if there is a tie. And in fact, they're really ever there, really in the Senate. They're going to delegate most of their responsibility of monitoring debate and presiding to other members for the most part. And specifically, that often falls on the president pro tempore. So the president pro tempore is that final position that's listed in the Constitution. They are going to, as I mentioned, preside over the Senate in the absence of the vice president. And something to think about too, if we're looking at presidential succession, looking at the 25th Amendment, right? The vice president would be right after the president if they were unable to serve. Then the Speaker of the House, then the president pro tempore of the Senate is third in line to the presidency. Now, this president pro tempore is technically like an honorary title. It really doesn't have any real power. Usually, this is the senior most member of the majority party. Senior, not necessarily meaning oldest, right? But the person who of the majority party has been in the Senate longest. So currently, this member, this president pro tempore, the current one has been in the Senate, the longest of the Democratic Party, since we technically do have a Democratic Senate with that tie-breaking vote of the vice president. Okay. Now, the majority and minority leaders of the Senate, really, there's not too much difference between them and their House counterparts. But the Senate majority leader, because of the absence of the vice president and simply the honorary title of the president pro tempore, the Senate majority leader, right, why I have a star here, is they actually have quite a bit of sway in the legislative agenda and policymaking process. They're kind of the real, quote unquote, official leader of the Senate. They're the first, again, recognized in debate, and really they set the calendar for the Senate. They decide, like the Speaker does with the Speaker or the House of Representatives, they're going to decide which bills go to debate and which do not. They guide the party caucus on issues and proposals. And the Senate minority leader does very similar things, just not to the extent of the majority leader. Now there's not too much to say when it comes to majority and minority whips in the Senate, and the caucuses and conference chairs. They are essentially the same as their House of Representative counterparts. But I just wanted to give you guys a brief overview of kind of the powers of these leaders in Congress. And, the next thing that we're going to do is start looking at the first step of the lawmaking process, and that is going to be committees. So we're going to take a look at what committees are used for, what types of committees exist, and ones that are specifically exclusive to just the House of Representatives, and kind of what role these leaders play when it comes to committees themselves. Okay, so starting with committees, the main purpose of committees is to break down the work that happens in Congress. When you think about the sheer number of representatives that there are and senators, we come up to 535. So in order to get things done, you have to break down and divide the workload, right? It's easier with a smaller group of people to get things done, to come to a consensus. You can be more efficient. You can tackle tough issues, draft precise legislation, right? Imagine if the entire House of Representatives would have to get together to write a bill, right? That would be an insane task with 435 different interests, right? Now, this also allows Congress to specialize their focus, right? Congress people come into office with multiple backgrounds or various backgrounds, some in law, some in business, some in education, for example. So they have an opportunity to specialize and become an expert in a field and contribute to that specific committee. Now, committees are where most of the process, as we will see, of lawmaking actually takes place. Committees also have subcommittees where details, very, very specific details, are decided. So this is really the hallmark of the lawmaking and legislative process. Now, something else that committees do is they also oversee how executive agencies administer the laws that Congress creates. So, this is that action of legislative or congressional oversight that we talked about during the unit on the bureaucracy and executive branch. So, just an example that we might all be familiar with. TSA, Transportation Security Administration. Congress, in that legislative or congressional oversight, authorized TSA to inspect airline passengers and belongings, and they continue to monitor and oversee that agency to make sure that it's doing its job. Now, committees are more important in the House and in the Senate, and the reason for that is, as we've mentioned multiple times in this unit, size, right? The House is much larger with 435 members versus the Senate's 100. So you need to have more committees or at least more rules to make sure that things are getting done effectively and efficiently and that it's not getting or staying in gridlock, so to speak. Now, committees are influenced heavily by the political party in charge, the majority, as well as congressional leadership. So party leaders, as we've looked at in the last video, choose who goes on what committee a bill goes to, who the committee chair people or chairperson is. They're also responsible for scheduling bills out of committees. So as we will see in the lawmaking process, it's very possible that bills never make it out of committees. And in fact, a lot of bills, most bills will actually die, so to speak, in a committee. Now, the committee chairman is also very important in this. They're usually chaired by a senior or experienced member of the majority party, and the majority party holds the majority of seats on each committee. So as you can tell, or see at least, the majority party has control then over the flow of legislation, right? What bills end up making it to the floor of each chamber for actual debate. Now, something else, just as an overview, not all committees are equal, right? Senators and representatives want to be placed on committees that have more power, right? Some committees have more at stake. For example, in the House of Representatives, there is the Ways and Means Committee, which we'll take a look at very shortly. And this is ultimately responsible for the House's really the bill that it's in charge for solely, as we've seen, is the revenue bills. So, right, all of the representatives want to have an influence on taxing, spending, and revenue. So there is a power that comes with being placed on a specific committee. And also what you come into Congress with in terms of your experience and expertise also influences your committee assignment. Now, talking about types of committees, there are a couple. So the first is a standing committee. Standing committees are permanent and they're focused on a particular subject and policy area. And this allows Congress and the committees to specialize on a few topics. Representatives can become experts, as we've mentioned before. So an example of this standing committee would be one in the House on Energy and Commerce, so the Energy and Commerce Committee. And this has authority on utilities and gasoline and almost any business matter. So as you can see, that is a very focused topic, and they will focus on a particular policy area itself. The second type of committee is a joint committee. And a joint committee is comprised of members from both houses of Congress. So it is senators and representatives meet together to discuss various topics. Usually joint committees are taxation and the economy, right? Yes, taxes and revenue have to start in the House of Representatives, but of course the Senate wants to have a say in those type of bills. So a joint committee will be formed to discuss those. There are also select committees, and these are temporary, unlike our standing and joint committees often. And these handle particular issues or even investigations. So for example, when Watergate was happening, there was a select committee set to investigate Watergate with Richard Nixon. In 2012, there was a committee to investigate the Benghazi terrorist attacks in Libya. So these are temporary. There's really no guidelines as long as it's a particular issue temporarily investigating something. And then finally, we have a conference committee, which we will take a look at again in the next video, but Just as an overview, they are responsible for resolving disputes in the differences between bills that are passed in the House and Senate. So this is a type of joint committee. So representatives and senators will join this committee and ultimately kind of create a compromise bill that will then be sent to the president. Now, Congress can also be organized into conferences and caucuses. And these are not specifically committees. Committees are very formal. These caucuses and conferences are more informal, non-governmental groups of like-minded people. And usually these groups organize or unite around a particular belief. So, for example, there is the Republican Party Conference and the Democratic Party caucus. And for these, right, the entire party membership within that chamber is a member. So in the Senate, the entire Democratic Party is a part of the Democratic Party caucus in the Senate, and same with the House, and then vice versa. These caucuses and conferences are where the representatives and senators will elect their respective leaders, set their agendas, name committee members. Now, there can be smaller conferences and caucuses, and these are usually even more specific. So for example, agriculture, business, women's issues, for example. Now, something to note about these conferences and caucuses is that the Senate is able to build longer lasting coalitions or groups because of their longer terms, right? They're in power longer, they don't have to worry about re-election, whereas the House tends to be more fluid in these organizations and conferences and caucuses. So I just wanted to give you guys an overview. There are many committees in the House and the Senate. There are 20 in the House, 15 in the Senate. As you can see here, economics, printing, taxation, those are the topics, as I mentioned, of the joint committees. So just an overview of what the House and the Senate have as standing, select, and joint committees. Now, there are some committees that are specific to the House of Representatives due to its size, and the first is the Ways and Means Committee. Now, this deals with tax policy specifically, right? We've seen that all revenue has to start in the House of Representatives. So this committee deals with any issue in particular, for example, of raising or lowering the income tax. That would be an example of something that the Ways and Means Committee would discuss. The second is the Rules Committee, and this is created or was created due to the size of the House of Representatives. And this is really what makes the process the most efficient in a chamber that size. Now, their main task is to assign bills to the appropriate standing committees, and ultimately the Rules Committee in the House impacts every single House bill. They have to review the bill and decide which committee it goes to. They will schedule bills for debate and when that vote would take place, if at all. So it has quite a bit of power, as we will see. And it also sets guidelines for debate. So for example, how much time a bill can be debated, how many amendments may be added. And also there is a guideline, for example, of something that is called a germane amendment. And a germane amendment means that all of these amendments or changes to the bill that have to be made must relate specifically to the legislation under consideration. And this is not a requirement in the Senate, and we'll see the difference when we get into the lawmaking process in the next video. Now, this Rules Committee is very, very powerful. It's very easy for the Rules Committee to simply dispose of a bill or define guidelines that would cause the defeat of the bill before it even makes it to the floor of the House. So think of the Rules Committee kind of as the traffic cop of the House floor, right? Nothing reaches the floor for debate unless the Rules Committee allows it. Now, generally, the Rules Committee will reflect the will and sentiment of the House leadership and the majority caucus or conference, right? Because as we said, the majority has the majority of seats in these committees. So usually whatever the party in charge kind of has on their agenda, the Rules Committee will see to it that those bills get put through first. Now, there is a final committee specific to the House, and that is the Committee of the Whole. Just basic overview here. This is designed to allow for longer debate in the House of Representatives. And what this does is it does this, by ultimately allowing for debate among fewer people. So the House, instead of voting individually, so 435 separate votes, the Committee of the Whole ultimately unites the House into various groups. And these groups of members then vote as a whole, as a group. So this allows for more debate to happen since the voting itself has to take less time. Okay, so that covers committees, guys. We're going to see the role that committees play a little bit more in depth in the next video. So stay tuned for part 2 of the lawmaking process. Bye, guys.